in the legislative process, we are at essentially the halfway point right now, and that means that the budget that begins in the House of Representatives must be passed over to the Senate by the end of this month. So it's action time this week in the House Appropriations Committee. And for most of the legislative session, the proposed university system funding has had us looking at about a $23 million funding hole or budget hole for the next 2 years if we ended the session with the budget as it is right now. That $23 million hole equates to about a 21% tuition increase across the campuses of the university system. So the rest of the legislative session will be focusing on seeing if we can get some funding restored. So there's going to be some executive action this afternoon in the House Appropriations Committee. We'll see what comes out of it. And then by the end of this month, the budget will go to the Senate side. At the same time, the Board of Regents is planning and analyzing what actions they might need to take in May, because at the May meeting is when the board will then decide on setting tuition rates for the next 2 years, and they cannot do that until we see what the state appropriation for higher education will be, because it's then tuition that makes up the balance in the cost of education. Where the state's funding commitment stops, that's where the student's tuition obligation begins. So it'll be the interesting rest of the week and the rest of the month in the House appropriations process.
Now, Kevin, have you had a chance in your listening to the sessions and talking with the legislators? Is the sentiment from them, are they holding firm on that, or is there some wiggle room or a little give there, or are you able to gauge that?
The difficulty is, definitely higher education has not been singled out for budget challenges. Those are across the board in all sectors of state government. So, in the same way that we are advocating for education funding to help keep the cost of tuition down and to help keep educational services extended across Montana, every section of the budget, Health and Human Services is advocating funding for low income and Montanans in needs of various medical and other services, and Corrections is advocating for funding for community safety and K-12 education. So across the board, we're similarly situated to all agencies. One of the things that makes it interesting is the governor's budget and the funding proposed by the governor, which would hold campus funding fairly level. It's not at the cut level proposed by the legislature. But the governor's budget relies on some certain either revenue enhancers or tax increases, as you may call them. And that there's about 6 of them. And those bills have, at least as of yet, not gotten legislative support. So it's really the overall process of balancing the state budget, deciding whether there's any room for tax adjustments, and then what does that mean for higher education and every other sector of state government.
Gotcha. All right. Now, when will you know for sure exactly what the numbers will be, Kevin?
It won't be until the very end of the session, which is scheduled to end April 27th if they use their full 90 days. And then the Board of Regents meeting in May is when the board will then look at what our state funding is as of April 27th and make decisions as to what needs to be what needs to occur to either raise tuition or make educational program cuts.
Now, Kevin, have you been hearing from representatives from the university system saying anything like this? If there is that drastic of an increase, since we haven't had any increases for almost a decade, that would really harm in recruiting and enrollment, that sort of thing?
There is a direct correlation to tuition prices and access to education. So for every dollar that tuition is increased, there is someone who makes a decision that they cannot afford to enroll in college this semester. So yeah, there is a concern there that any tuition adjustments that we make, we would well could be looking at making education